So it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. We're pleased to have Mr. Mark Mills with us. And I'm going to digress here just for a second. He spoke yesterday at our board meeting, at the end of our board meeting. I think he did just a fantastic job. You're going to be excited. He's a riveting speaker, and he really has a great perspective on things. Mark is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a faculty member at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science. He's a regular contributor to Forbes, co-author of The Bottomless Well, The Twilight of Fuel, The Virtue of Waste, and Why We Will Never Run Out of Energy, which is very interesting, which was #1 on Amazon's Science and Math rankings. His articles have been published in magazines including The Wall Street Journal and USA Today. He's appeared as a guest on CNN, Fox, NBC, and PBS, and on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Mark served in the White House Science Office under President Ronald Reagan and has provided science and technology policy counsel to numerous private sector firms, the Department of Energy, and the U.S. Research Lab. Please help me welcome Mr. Mark Mills.
Thank you, Paul. Good job. Thank you, Paul, and thank all of you and your board for the honor and privilege of talking to you this morning. I'm going to do some forecasting. So I'm going to look to the future. Paul has talked about your past and how you're preparing for your future. For those of you who have read my biography, you probably know that I'm essentially a professional forecaster. I work in the pundit sphere a bit as a writer and testify before Congress and the Senate frequently as in my role as a policy analyst in the Manhattan Institute. But I also work in the real world, not that politics aren't the real world, but on the front lines, if you like, of business as a partner in a venture fund where I do forecasting on the micro level, which is we look at investments in software for the oil and gas industry. So we're, by definition, doing forecasting about technology and markets, much as you do. Forecasting business is an interesting one. So I'm going to just do, obviously because of the nature of what we're here about, I'm just going to forecast about energy and specifically tell you or try to convince you, and you can tell by this title, what my opinion is about this new construct we have for the last decade, and particularly the last 5 years. That we have a forecast that's running rampant in investment circles and in policy circles and in technology circles, that we're entering a new energy economy, that the changes in the energy infrastructure and the technologies of energy are so profound that we're entering something that is revolutionary. You can see by the last word in the title what my opinion is in advance about whether or not we're entering a new energy economy. We're not. But there are things that are different, and some of the things that are different are very important. They're not irrelevant, they're not immaterial. When you do forecasting, it's a difficult task because you get involved in wishful thinking and aspirational sort of mindset about what you want to have happen, especially if you are a policymaker. One would hope that as a business leader and a planner that you resist the temptations of aspirational forecasting. And the biggest problem with forecasting, especially in the energy domains, is that the engineers are the ones that invent the future, not the forecasters. I mean, if you think about what has happened in the last couple of decades, but more importantly, the last century, forecasts about energy constantly fail, and they fail because we get surprised by what engineers invent and build. These are two obvious, iconic examples on the demand side, right? If you look at, this is for those of you who don't recognize that painting, that's a painting in the lobby of the Brown Palace in Denver, the historic hotel, circa 1950, about air travel. Once we had invented airplanes, people liked to fly for commerce, but more importantly, 70% plus of all travelers on aircraft travel for leisure, entertainment, for fun. Airplanes use about 6 million barrels per oil per day. They used none before the invention of airplanes. Forecasters who, at that time, and there were forecasters, there's always been forecasters, guessed wrong about oil demand with respect to leisure and entertainment because of the invention of the airplane. Similarly, the computer was not anticipated as a common commodity product. The invention of the computer is now obvious in history. Most people don't focus on its energy features. And about 70% of the internet traffic that exists today, the use of data tools, is for entertainment, for leisure, not for business. That's the state of the world today. And it turns out, ironically enough, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, that the data industry itself also uses energy, but it uses more energy than aviation. In oil equivalent terms, about 10 million barrels per day. If you had made forecasts about energy use in either of those two eras in the decades following, you would have got a lot of things wrong. So the forecasting that I'm going to show for you about what has changed and what has not changed in our world and our future, in our near future, by that I mean the next couple of decades, they're rooted really in three principles, and I think these principles apply to business planning, by the way, not just to high-level forecasting about what's going to happen to America or the world. The three principles you always have to have in mind are not complicated, right? You have to keep in mind the laws of human behavior, the laws of economics, and the laws of physics. I mean, by that I mean, if you make forecasts based on the assumption that people will change their behavior in some radical way, you're probably going to be wrong, because human beings haven't changed much in their behaviors for maybe 10,000 years, certainly all of recorded history. All the passions and desires are the same. In energy terms, look, it distills to this. The reason we use energy is not for commerce per se. Commerce is part of a broader purpose. We use energy because of the human desire for convenience, comfort, safety, beauty, and fun. That's it. That's why we use energy. Those are the things that human beings like when they've gone beyond subsistence. In the second rule set, rules of economics, are very easy to distill. Everybody likes the stuff that's essential or the things that they prefer to be cheaper, period. And if you violate that rule, we know to repeat a political phrase in this political season we've just ended, as Paul mentioned, what Bill Clinton put on his first election campaign. Remember the famous line, "It's the economy, stupid." So obviously other things matter, but when you're a forecaster about technology, you have to keep in mind that the economic principles never change. You cannot, if you forget that, and you know this as owner-operators of businesses, you will not only get your forecast wrong, you can damage your business, or if it's a country, you can damage the economy. And the third rule, this set of rules, and I'm going to illustrate each of these with specific examples in energy domains, are, of course, the laws of physics. You can violate the laws of physics. I mean, obviously, you can try. It doesn't have a good outcome when you do that. I mean, gravity works, right? If you step off a cliff, it's not a good outcome. You know these very basic laws of physics are true. A lot of energy forecasts violate laws of physics, not in obvious ways, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's look at two domains quick, and I've divided the domains of forecasting into the two obvious ones, the demand and the supply of energy. Demand, the iconic things that we are talking a lot about and reading about in terms of how energy technologies are changing demand, of course, are electric cars and self-driving cars, robocars. There's a lot of writing and talking about how that's going to change the demand for oil and the demand for electricity. Then we'll look at supply, and of course, as you know, because you're living it day to day in the electric business, the principal premise about the structural change in the energy industry is specifically focused on wind and solar, and of course, collaterally batteries. Let's talk about supply first. A lot of talk about this revolution. You read about it constantly, that there's been an energy revolution and that there's been a structural, fundamental change in our energy economy because of wind and solar. So wind and solar are cheaper than they were 20 years ago. This is true, but the word revolution actually has meaning. It gets overused as a consequence. It's sort of lost its meaning, but let's take a look at what kind of revolution has happened in America in the last 20 years, roughly. So this is a graph that you can see that on the y-axis, and I'm going to do data graphs like Paul did because, well, the facts kind of matter, in my opinion, when it comes to forecasting about energy. So here you have a y-axis, which is the additional supply of energy to the United States in millions of barrels of oil equivalent, so that you can now compare on the same apples to apples, wind and solar to oil and gas. Okay, the additions to American energy production from 2005 to date from wind and solar, that's the blue line. You can see going up to where that vertical gray line is today. And the green line is the additional supply to U.S. energy production from wind and solar combined. So blue is oil and gas combined, green is wind and solar combined. You can see it's obvious, right? The blue line has gone up more. In fact, the increase in energy supply to America in the last decade from wind and solar versus oil and gas, there's been 400% more net new energy. Not 40%, not 4%. 400% more net new energy added to America's supply in the last decade from oil and gas than from wind and solar. Let's stipulate that the wind and solar increase has come with the benefit not only of utilities being told in many states that they have to build wind and solar plants, requirements, but also from $150 billion in cumulative subsidies. Those are the direct subsidies. I've estimated that the indirect subsidies over that time period are probably closer to $200 billion. So there's somewhere between $200 and $300 billion of stimulation to bring wind and solar online the last decade. And if you're in the oil and gas business, you haven't been given any subsidies. If you're lucky, you've been left alone. And it's not always that you get left alone. Colorado just had a ballot initiative where they're going to largely leave the oil and gas industry alone. By that I don't mean not regulated from a safety perspective. I mean to have hostile regulations. Going forward, the EIA, which is a pretty good forecaster, except that 20 years ago they completely missed the shale revolution, but that's okay. That would be like missing the aviation revolution in 1940 as a commercial business. It was a military business, not a commercial business. Going forward, they're forecasting the solid blue line, which is that the growth rate in production from oil and gas will slow. I happen to think that the growth rate in oil and gas production will follow the dotted line, which is the EIA's optimistic technology forecast. I work in the tech business. I think their optimistic technology forecast is possibly an underestimate. But let's take their blue line. They also forecast going forward increased production from wind and solar on the assumption that the subsidies and the tax credits continue indefinitely. They're not assuming they go away. They're assuming that they're politically difficult to kill. And what you can see is that going out another 10 or 20 years, that the increase in production of energy from wind and solar subsidized will be about 200%. Reverse that. The oil and gas will be 200% more than wind and solar. In revolution terms, the blue line's a revolution. The green line's not a revolution. It's not nothing. The oil and gas business has gotten much bigger, but the wind business is much bigger in relative terms. It was nothing, as you know, 10 or 20 years ago. So it's a very significant increase. It's not nothing. It's not a revolution. In fact, let me put the revolution in geopolitical context. The increase in oil and gas production in America in the last 10 years is the largest increase in energy production in terms of velocity and scale that the world has ever seen from any energy form, full stop. This is significant. That's a revolution. By the way, the Saudis know this, the Russians know this, and they know it hasn't stopped. So there is a whole discussion around this structural and profound geopolitical change in the nature of the oil and gas business. It's important because the rest of the world's graphs, if I drew different countries, would all look a lot like this, with the exception of tiny, homogeneous countries with very few people. The whole world looks like this. The whole world looks like this going forward. Oil is the world's largest traded commodity. It's a larger commodity than all other commodities combined. The world is consuming 100 million barrels per day of oil, with the U.S. as the largest hydrocarbon liquids producer on the planet and the fastest growing one. We've reset the geopolitics in ways we still have yet to incorporate into our policies, except in some minor ways. Imagine if we had threatened an embargo on a country like Iran, which produced a couple of million barrels per day, and taken that much oil off the market through sanctions, would have caused the price of oil to go up 50% or double. It hasn't moved the meter. In fact, the price of oil's gone down. It's gone down because of your friends in the Bakken and the Permian and in the Scoop and in Colorado. So, but when I show you that picture, let me just tell you what I know comes to many of your minds, and I hear this directly, especially from students, but people when you're in small settings. They say, well, the wind and solar are going to get better. And so they'll grow faster because they're going to improve technologically. Engineers do that. Well, of course they're going to get better. All technologies get better. So do shale rigs get better. Everything gets better. You have to ask yourself what the starting point is in basic engineering economics. Since you're in businesses that you spend money, capital, to build assets to produce energy, this graph should have some salience to you. If you strip away subsidies, wishful thinking, you're ordered to build or buy something, just ask an engineer how much stuff he can build for $1 million. And then you just calculate how much energy that stuff will produce over 30 years. Because basically you're on average trying to build assets in every industry that will last something like 30 years, right? That's what you want with big capital assets. What this shows you is what $1 million buys you in solar, wind, and a shale rig. If you buy $1 million of utility-grade solar panels, not rooftop, that's much more expensive, and you run them for 30 years, you get about 50,000 barrels of oil equivalent energy produced over those 30 years. That's what the graph, this is easy to calculate. This is not made up stuff. You can do it literally in arithmetic, it's not math, on the back of an envelope. If you put the same $1 million into a wind turbine, you get almost triple the energy over the 30 years. That's why there's a lot more wind turbines than solar arrays, right? They're about triple the economic value. You get almost 150,000 barrels of oil equivalent from wind turbines. Those wind turbines, by the way, will have to be in places like the Dakotas in the Midwest where there's lots of wind. If you put them on the East Coast, you get less. If you put the same $1 million of CapEx into a shale rig in the Bakken, the average will get you about 400,000 barrels of actual oil, or natural gas in oil equivalent terms. This is a huge difference. You can hide those differences with subsidies, but you can't hide the difference in the physics of these two domains. By the way, you probably, if you're in the energy business, you probably know that if I produce the gas, I still have to pay for the capital for a gas turbine to make it a utility useful product. That costs money. But to make wind and solar useful at society scales, right, I have to buy something else too. I have to buy batteries that Paul mentioned. Well, you may know this, but today the CapEx for the batteries is about triple the CapEx for a high-quality recuperated combustion turbine. But let me put it this way. If we decided to take a path in the, quote, new energy economy where the majority of our energy was going to come from wind and solar, not some is fine, but the majority, so that we had to build enough batteries so they could be dispatchable assets, not use on demand, not use as produced, but use on demand, which is how the electric grid runs. You all know this. Consumers want electricity when they want it. How many batteries do you think you have to build to turn wind and solar into a utility-grade asset? This is also easy to figure out. You need 400 years worth of the total world's production of lithium batteries to store 1 day worth of American electric demand. 400 years of all the world's productions of lithium batteries today to store 1 day's worth of America's electricity demand. So that fact alone will tell you, I'm not talking about how much it would cost, just the fact. That fact alone tells you why there are limits to how much wind and solar a national, a region, or a large grid can handle. But again, people say it'll get better. So I'm beating to death this it'll get better piece, because this is the physics part, and then we won't do a lot more physics this morning, because it is morning. But the refrain that keeps coming back from the enthusiasts for wind, solar, and batteries is they keep saying it'll get better. Well, they're looking at the past, not the future. So this is a graph it's normalizing the capital cost of a solar array or a wind turbine going back from 1980 to date, forecast into the future for 20 years. This comes from the National Renewable Energy Labs, DOE, so it's not my forecast. You can see the shape of this curve. You remember your high school math? This curve is called an asymptote, or in English, the law of diminishing returns. I mean, at some point, all things reach a law of diminishing returns. Airplanes can't go faster than they go because they run into physics limits. So you have to build different kinds of airplanes. Speed of sound limits commercial aircraft. Supersonic planes go to a certain limit again, there's a physics limit, and then you have to build rocket ships. I mean, so you can build different things, but each time the different thing, and those examples are typical, gets much more expensive. Here's just the bottom line of what we know. If you look at the physics limits of the shale industry, what you want to know is what percentage of the hydrocarbons are you taking out of the rocks that you're using to extract the oil and gas molecules. We're getting on average 5 to 10% of the molecules out. the best producers can get maybe 10 or 15%. That would just tell you that if we could easily make them twice as good, shell rigs, for the same CapEx by using magic of software, which is what's actually happening. In the solar and wind world, the 10x gains and the 5x and 2x gains are all behind us. So we've done these things. And we're now facing physics limits. So I'll just tell you, for those of you who are interested in this very briefly, a wind turbine obviously can't produce more energy than the amount of energies in the wind, the kinetic energy of moving wind, and you could only extract a specific amount of energy out of the motion of the wind. If you take all the energy out of the motion of the wind, there's no wind, right? So the turbine stops. I mean, so you have to let the wind go by the turbine. The question for an engineer or a physicist is, what's the limit? The answer is, it's called a Betz limit, B-E-T-Z. It's 60%, roughly, of the kinetic energy in wind can be extracted with the turbine working at perfect efficiency, which we never get to in the real world. Turbines today run about 45%. So you got room to improve them, but you can't make them twice as good. You can't make them 10 times better. Solar is the same way. There's a limit called the Shockley limit for the number of photons from the sun you can make into electrons. It's just locked in the universe we live in. You can't change it unless you move to a different universe, and that's science fiction. So we're stuck with it. Or you can move the Earth closer to the sun, and there's more photons. But that's hard to do except in Star Trek. So we're stuck with the Shockley limit. The Shockley limit for converting photons to electrons is about 34%. You can't do better than that with the silicon photovoltaic cells. The cells that are shipped today run about 26%. You can make them better, but not profoundly better. You can't make them 2x better. You can't make them 10x better. You can make them cheaper by producing them higher volume, but all the inputs to these devices are already commodities. Commodities that are already in high volume, which is steel, concrete, silica, right? Nickel, cadmium, all these things are already in high volume. Increasing the demand for high volume of our already high volume commodity has an effect that every farmer knows. The price doesn't go down, it goes up. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if we keep subsidizing, essentially indirectly subsidizing commodities in the mining industry. Prices are not going to go down. The effect of pushing more of these kinds of technologies onto grids is demonstrable. We've done the experiment. By saying we, Western democracies have done this experiment, mostly in Europe. I'll just tell you what this graph shows you, and it's obvious, right? The y-axis is the cents per kilowatt hour. They're euro cents, but that's close enough to US cents. X-axis is the share of the grid that is wind plus solar. It's the wind and solar capacity in watts per capita. And you can see as you increase the amount of wind and solar per capita by roughly 4 to 5-fold, you roughly double the cost of electricity for those countries. So the experiment's been done in Denmark and Germany. It doesn't mean you can't increase wind and solar from roughly where we are today of about 6% to, say, 25%. But what we will get from that is an experiment that's already been done. We'll roughly double the nation's electricity costs. I would just submit to you that while they did that experiment and did double their costs in many European countries, I don't think that the US political system will tolerate this trajectory. And the earlier data that I showed you would suggest, I think, if you believe what I showed you, you can easily do this research casually by looking online at the National Renewable Energy Labs. We don't have any path to make wind and solar profoundly cheaper. But a lot of people say we just got to get started anyway. We got to just start building these wind and solar arrays, and you know it's because of climate change. We have to have this change. This is what the Clean Power Plan was pushing. This graph is an important one because it doesn't have any money attached to it. So let's just stipulate that the wind and solar might cost exactly the same at some future time. You believe that. Let's just say you don't believe me. You don't believe any of the physicists who could tell you otherwise. Just let's say you think it gets the same price, unsubsidized. How much of the stuff do you have to build to reach the goal, which is the new energy economy goal at its extreme? 100% of America's electricity comes from wind and solar. I mean, that's the end point. That's the goal, and in fact, it's a professed goal of many policy lobbyists. So what this graph shows you is the construction rate in watts per capita per year for power plants. The blue line way down there at the bottom is the US construction rate in watts per year per capita of coal and nuclear plants. You can see the peak in the 70s, where we built something on the order of 200 watts per capita per year of coal and nuclear plants. And then we had another peak in the early 2000s of almost 220 watts per year per capita natural gas power plants. Germany almost matched that peak building out solar arrays. Their electricity, by the way, is triple the cost of the American retail rate. Okay, that's what we've been out. This is what economically vibrant, big economies, Germany is one of the world's biggest economies, have been able to build in terms of capital assets at the rate of construction in those nations. The red line is the construction rate you need to have for wind and solar. This is not dollars, this is the construction rate to achieve the 100% renewable goal by 2050. It's 700% higher. This is beyond wartime footing construction rates. Not going to happen. This is what's going to happen. This is a map of the percentage of the world's electricity that nuclear energy produces. Nuclear power plants are profoundly capital intensive. We haven't managed to change that in 30 to 40 years. From 1970 to date, nuclear power started from nearly nothing, rose to almost 16% of the world's electricity, peaked and sort of started to drop off. Part of that was 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. Most of that was just the money. Is that economies that were building them just can't tolerate that amount of capital. They're great power plants, but the share of a grid that can be in that kind of long-term capital asset's limited. The green line is the trajectory so far for wind and solar combined. Wind and solar are roughly in the same order of magnitude. The kind of initial capital costs, if you like, are actually higher than nukes. I think my forecast is the green line will follow the red line. Now, if you're an investor in wind and solar, that's pretty bullish. I mean, that's like a tripling of the world's wind and solar capacity. That's not nothing, but it doesn't get you past 15% of the world's energy. That's not a new energy economy, and it's not a revolution. This is what the past looks like. This is what the future looks like in primary global energy supply. The green line is coal, oil, and gas, hydrocarbons. They started in the 1960s at almost 90%. They've declined to roughly 70% and are continuing to decline slowly as nuclear, hydro, and renewables climb slowly. There's nothing wrong with this in the sense that this is a natural sort of migration. This is not a revolution. There's no step function here. How about the demand side? That was the supply side. There's no supply side revolution. Again, restating, it's not that wind and solar aren't viable for many and significant applications. You have a lot of it. That's a different observation. That's sort of an all-of-the-above observation than saying we're entering a, quote, new energy economy. You could enter the new energy economy that Germany demonstrated, where you get to triple the penetration rate of wind and solar we have here. That new economy will have triple the costs for electricity, because nothing in the physics and engineering economics of those power systems has changed fast enough or different enough to change the economic outcome. Demand side. A lot of what's being said now is, look, if you're in the oil business, it's not that we don't know you can produce oil, we're going to need it anymore because of Elon Musk, right? I mean, it's put unkindly, it's what I would call the Tesla derangement syndrome, right? This is not a Musk derangement. Elon Musk is an incredible entrepreneur. He's done something all the other tech geniuses didn't want to tackle. They all want to do software. He took on hardware. This is really hard. I worked in the hardware industry and I've worked in the software industry. Building stuff is really a lot harder than building code. It just is. That's why the code industry is so growing so fast, so much venture capital going into it. There's not been a new car company in America that succeeded in 80 years. This is a hell of an accomplishment. I mean, I just love the guy for doing this. But that has nothing to do with the observation that means we're going to have all the cars in the world are going to be electric, and therefore we won't need oil anymore. The first thing that comes along, though, on the car forecast is not just that they're going to be electric, it's that people aren't going to drive anymore. It's what I call the Uber effect, right? The caring effect. We're all going to share everything. We're always going to share stuff. If you share stuff, you drive less. And also, millennials are different than us, we're told. Us boomers. Most of us, I think, are boomers here, I'm guessing, looking out here. So there's millennials here. We're told they're different. They like to bicycle and take scooters and share and bus and all this stuff. And the proof of that is this graph. The big kahuna in energy demand is cars. and you measure car use in road miles. This graph shows you the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration data on thousands of billions. The y-axis is thousands of billions of road miles that America consumes a year. It's trillions if you go to that. So we're about 3 trillion road miles. Been increasing for 100 years. Comes 2007, 8, and all of a sudden, boom, peaks, goes down, and goes flat. That was the era the millennials came of age, graduated from college, and what we were told by all the forecasters and the pundits was, oh, wow, look, millennials are different. They're cooler than you old boomers. They're happy to do all these more energy-efficient things. They aren't driving. And so for 7 years, I fought the forecasters saying, no, they're not different. They don't have a job. They're in the basement. I got 4 kids. I got all of them out of the basement, but they're all working, productive, it's great. What is the first thing that millennials will do? I thought when they had a job and some money, they'll buy a car. So the clearest measure that we're out of recession will be road miles and cars purchased, because it's a thing you can do first and fastest. The other thing that will happen, of course, is that the parents supporting the kids will also take more vacations because they'll have some money left over now, and they'll drive more. And also commerce will increase. People will commute more. All these, well, the data, you can see this graph. Like, this was a delicious graph for me, vindication after 7 years of arguing. No, they're not different. In fact, the data show that boomers are buying cars at a higher rate than we did at their age, and they're not buying, you can look this data up, they're not buying Priuses. They're not buying Teslas because they don't have that much money yet. Right? They're buying SUVs and sports cars at a higher rate than the boomers did at the same age. And they're driving more because you see the curve is steeper, and then it started to levelize, getting back to the normal growth rate. But those road miles are going to be battery road miles eventually. That's the script. A lot of them are going to be battery powered. Yeah, I mean, this is good for if you like load, this is great. And my friends in the utility industry who I've worked with for 30 years have always loved electric vehicles. We're finally going to have lots of them. Okay, that's my forecast. This is uncomplicated. I like the forecast in the manner in which Peter Drucker advised. All of you know, I'm sure, Peter Drucker, the great management consultant, a terrific management consultant. He was also trained as a psychologist, and he pioneered the management consulting philosophy of bringing humanity to how you plan a business and think about your employees, as opposed to thinking of them as cogs. Anyway, one of his most famous lines, for me at least, was he said he stopped forecasting when he wrote in 1929, before the great crash, that the stock market was going to go up the next day, and he said, I just never made a forecast again in my life, except, he said, now I only forecast what's already happened. So you listen to that and you think, well, that's kind of silly. No, he meant something meaningful. He looked at the underlying facts that were already occurring, and you just push them a little bit into the future. Things that are already going on are meaningful. Well, we're already making lots of electric cars. The world has 3 million now. We didn't have 3 million EVs 5 years ago. So easy to forecast, there'll be more. The key question is, how many more? And what's the impact on oil markets if you're an oil guy? And what's the load if you're an electric company? So this is a summary of a global forecast made by the International Energy Agency about a year ago. You get why there's a range, right? It's depending on your nomenclature, pessimistic to optimistic to wildly optimistic. Take the top red line, the most wildly optimistic forecast that any serious analysts of the car industry put out there, and we're being told that we're going to go to a world of about 300 million electric cars in about 20 years. We're at 3 million today. So you know that to take any industry, we're talking about building stuff, from that level up 100-fold in 20 years. We're not talking about software and apps here. We're talking about tires and steel and lithium carbonate and nickel. It means that this is a heavy industry, literally. 100-fold growth is extremely difficult, I think highly improbable, but let's just take it. The top line, 300 million EVs are in the world in about 15 to 20 years. There are about 1 billion cars in the world today. There will be about 2 billion cars in the world when that happens. So you could do, this is morning arithmetic, I recognize, but it's not math. 300 million out of 2 billion is 15%, right? So 15% of the world's cars are displaced. 15% of the world's automotive oil consumption will be displaced in the most optimistic scenario, but except cars only use half of the world's oil. So it's actually 7%. So the most optimistic scenario for a Tesla-like future is significant. It's a lot of electric cars. It's a lot of load, but it displaces less than 7% of global oil demand. I would put to you that let's hope that happens. The reason you want that to happen is not because we hate oil, it's because we need oil so much. That much change on the margin will actually keep prices of oil down. The price of oil oscillates by plus or minus $50 a barrel on getting wrong a 1% change in future supply demand. So if there's a 7% change in the future supply demand, on the downside, pulling it down by 7%, you can be sure that this is very, very bearish if you're an oil seller. It's very bullish if you're a consumer of oil. It's a good thing. But the batteries will get better. Now, you note that I didn't stipulate the batteries are good, bad, or indifferent. Let's assume that they cost the same as an oil-fired car. They don't today. You know, that's why there's subsidies. An unsubsidized electric car, it costs about 50% more than an unsubsidized equivalent gasoline car. That's because of the batteries. Here's the problem in the physics. This is how many miles you can go per pound of fuel, red line, in an internal combustion engine car. And the blue line is how many miles you can go per pound of fuel on a Tesla or a Bolt or whatever, you know, the new BMW I think it's called the i4, the new Audi e-tron. Great cars, better than the Tesla in my opinion. This is a big gap, and both of them are getting better. So the proposition that's put out is that batteries will get twice as good. No one, by the way, thinks that we can get batteries getting twice as good in the short term. Very difficult physical chemistry. But assume that happens. The little jump in the blue line at the bottom, that's making batteries twice as good. We can make that oil line twice as good tomorrow. There's no mystery to it. If you want to buy the most efficient, high-performance internal combustion engine, but we know they exist because they're in race cars, that red line goes up 2x. Gap just keeps widening. Let me put it in different terms for you. If you make a barrel of oil equivalent of energy from a wind turbine, okay? By the way, a standard wind turbine, about 2 megawatts, produces a barrel of oil equivalent in an hour. Okay? A shale rig in the Bakken, just for calibration point, produces a barrel of oil in a minute. Just to pretend it was your money, because in your business it's your money, and you bought a wind turbine, you bought a shale rig. This is the difference in what you actually get for it. Not counting subsidies and tax preferences, but you want to store it, because if you have a mobile transport thing that's not plugged in on wire or tethered, you have to store it. So to store a barrel of oil equivalent of electricity, you need 20,000 pounds of Tesla batteries. A barrel of oil weighs 300 pounds. That's what this gap is showing you. One last thing on batteries, on what I would call the Tesla effect. Energy, I mean, there's no free lunch. This is sort of a law of physics. It's also a law of economics and human behavior. There's no free lunch. So if you switch from internal combustion to batteries, you still have to dig stuff out of the ground. The commodities, obviously. This is the graph of the increase in the commodities of nickel, cobalt, and lithium, manganese that the world will need in a 30 million EV world, not a 300 million. Or put in different terms, some commodity production only goes up 50%, some of it goes up 500%, a fivefold. Remember, you have lots of farmers. Some of you may be farmers. My family, my father grew up on a farm. I lived in farm country most of my life growing up. Wonderful thing when demand for commodity goes up if you're a producer. It really is. But if you're the manufacturer of a battery, 80% of the cost to make a battery is the commodities. That's the future. An energy point for you, by the way. It costs energy to make a battery. Oh, this is sort of a physics no duh. It's 120 barrels of oil equivalent of energy to produce a battery that can store a barrel of oil equivalent. Just to have that in your head. Where is that energy going to come from? Somewhere. We'll make it. So let me very briefly cover the other two phenomenologies in transportation, because transportation really is the big kahuna in energy forecasting on the demand side. It's the Uber effect, right? The Uber effect is if you share cars and people are sharing them, they're using less fuel because it's like a bus. It's like a mini bus. It's a bus service. If you share it. If you don't share it, it doesn't make any difference. It just means you have somebody driving you instead of you driving you. I'll get to the Robocar in a second. But what is the principal effect of Uber, though? If you think about what the principal impact of Uber, other than convenience, I'm talking about an economic metric. The principal impact of Uber is it's lowered the cost to get into a vehicle that you don't own. It's lowered rental costs. You're renting by the mile, in effect. So it's hugely impacted Hertz and Avis business, as I'm sure you know. It's impacted the taxi business because it's a very low-cost model. Here's what we know about the economics of transportation and therefore the economics of energy transportation. We know this is an immutable fact. This is a prediction that I'm happy to take a real bet on. This is that in simplest terms. If you make it cheaper to get in a car, which means you become wealthier, so it's cheaper to get in the car, or make getting in the car cheaper, people drive more. That's what happens. This is a graph of the miles per capita on the y-axis internationally. The x-axis is the wealth per capita, and you see a straight line. It's literally 1 to 1. Every 10% reduction in cost or increase in wealth has a 10% increase in road miles driven in a country. Eventually that saturates, right? It just people don't want to spend any more time in a car. But what Uber will do is rob the miles that people now use to be in subways and trains ultimately. The most energy efficient way you can move people is pack them together tight and close. It's the thing that people like to do the least. It's my law of human nature. People don't want to do that. If you give me a choice between getting in a Suburban without any other goobers with me or being packed in the subway in Manhattan, okay, make them the same price, we know what happens. The only utility for subways at that point is to store Ubers that aren't being used, because nobody's going to take them if they were the same price. Another Uber effect, by the way, very quickly, is it'll increase the number of cars manufactured. The Uber effect is a way of sharing an expensive capital asset. If you share an expensive capital asset, that's a way of saying I made it cheaper. We already know what happens if you make it easier for people to buy a car. People own more than one car. This is a graph in America. The top line is the population. The bottom orange line is the number of drivers. The middle line is the number of vehicles. They started bifurcating in America in the mid-'70s. By that I mean we have a country where there are more vehicles than there are drivers to drive them. This is an obvious thing if you think about yourself probably, a lot of your friends and neighbors. There are more cars in a lot of houses than there are people who drive them. People have a commuting car or a fun car, or they have the F-150 or Ram for driving around on the farm, but you use your Prius because you like the Prius when you go to work, whatever. This phenomenology is a wealth effect. Uber is basically a wealth effect. It'll make it cheaper and easier to get more cars. And if you get more cars, you have to manufacture more cars. You don't drive them more, but you have to manufacture more of them. It takes energy to manufacture cars. So going back to this graph, what that tells you is that whatever the energy is to manufacture a car, which is, by the way, about 15 to 20% of the energy a car that you use consumes over its life. So if you have 2 cars, you've actually increased your energy consumption by 20% per car. It's as if your fuel efficiency was whacked by 20% by the mere fact of owning a second car, even though you don't drive it simultaneously, because you can't. It's because it took energy to make the car, even though it's asset sitting there. Uber accelerates that. Robocar is the one that's easiest to debunk. I'm going to spend a long time on this because you could spend a whole day talking about the infatuation with the idea that automated systems are going to drive all of us around. This is going to happen one day. I know a fair bit about the sensors and the radars and the LiDARs that are used. I was in the business for years, and that was involved with that. I was actually involved in the design of those systems when I was a young professional and scientist and engineer in the defense contracting. I was involved with making, designing, and looking at what are called vision systems for situational awareness for the military. I want to see what's out there. This is a very complicated area. It's very difficult, much more difficult than people think. It will happen eventually. It's not coming as fast as all the... the unkind word would be to say that all the mouth breathers that are really enthusiastic about it say. They really, I know they're enthusiastic about robocars. They're just wrong about how fast they're going to come. And they're wrong about the effect of them when they do come. But first, just quickly, we know robocars will happen essentially this way. When the robot can drive far more safely than people can on average. So today, Waymo bragged last week that their robocars have now reached 10 million test road miles. Sounds like a big number, right? And so far, by the way, statistically, the number of people that have been killed by robots in cars, I mean, there have been deaths, and I don't mean to make light of that, is statistically much higher than the accident rate on the highway from people on average, right? Just in terms of deaths per road mile. So robocars right now are killing people at a higher rate than people are killing themselves on the roads, statistically. By the way, just calibrate this. When I use the statistics for the nation, this includes driving stupidly, driving speeding, driving up all tires in rain, drunken co-eds, drunken, freshmen of all kinds and all persuasions. This is, if you just look at sensible drivers driving at the speed limit with good tires and not drinking, their accident rate is roughly 1/10 the national average accident rate. So put differently, you driving your car sensibly right now, statistically, you're 20 to 50 times safer than the robot driving you. I'd take me. I mean, I don't want the robot driving me yet. But it'll come eventually. It takes a lot of computing power. We aren't there yet. There's more road miles. Instead the 10 million, again, this is where numbers matter. There are more road miles consumed in America in the first 5 minutes of the morning commute than the total cumulative road miles that all the Robocar makers have accumulated to date. They don't have enough experience yet. But when it happens, what will happen is people will drive more. That's what's going to happen. If you had to go a great distance in the heartland that you all occupy, I mean, if you have to go a distance of 400 miles or 300 miles, flying is annoying. Driving, basically the tipping point's 200 miles. You drive 200 instead of fly. Too annoying most of the time. But if your car, if you really trusted your car or your F-150, and you could read or sleep, well, it drove you there. You take that in a heartbeat over flying. That'll actually use more energy. You take it in a heartbeat over a train. It's like a decoupled train that goes from point to point that you care about. This lowers the cost of transportation. These data sets, I'll share all these slides with all of you if you want them after. I'll give them to our friends at Basin Corporate, and they can send you the PDF so you can have this data set. The effect of a Robocar is that it lowers the cost of getting you from A to B for all kinds of other things, like short distances, you take trains or flying. It also opens up the possibility for the roughly 100 million people that will be in America in 20 years who will be too young to drive or too infirm or too old to drive themselves. So instead of being driven around in a shared van or staying at home, they'll be getting in a Robocar. Very bullish for road miles. It won't really matter whether the Robocar is fueled by natural gas, charging a battery, or with oil. It just uses more energy. But the big Robocar effect, which is kind of a fun one for me because I'm a tech guy and I started my life in the semiconductor industry. My first job was in a manufacturing plant making integrated circuits. This is a graph of the amount of the cost of electronics as a share of the bill of materials to manufacture a car. You will be unsurprised to know that in 1950, is about 2% of the cost of the bill of materials for a car was in electronic components. Today, it's about 1/3 of the cost of a car is electronic components. I don't care what kind of car you have. The least cost car now has a couple of dozen computers in it and a whole raft of other subsidiary electronic components. We're on track to half of the cost of a car to be tied up in the silicon electrical components. And this does not assume robocars. If you go to a Robocar, the compute power you need to actually have the kind of software that's suitable not to kill the passengers requires a supercomputer class CPUs, not what's being used in cars today. Computers use energy. The supercomputer class CPU that's in the trunk right now actually degrades the fuel efficiency of the car by 2 to 5%. If you go to the supercomputer class computers that you really would need today, the energy consumed by the computer is 10 times the fuel used by the car just to drive the car. But we'll make it more efficient, like 10 times more efficient, which just means that the computer will use roughly as much energy as the car uses to drive itself in the future. So let me tell you a bottom line about electricity, because I've been on oil a lot, and there's going to be demand for electricity, of course. So this is remember the graph I showed you of road miles? Same y-axis, thousands of billions, but now the units in red are thousands of billions of kilowatt hours in America instead of thousands of billions of road miles. And what you see is a very similar curve. We know this curve. You've seen it many other places and times. You take it back any time period you want. The demand for electricity has been rising with the population and the economy for 100 years. And the only blips have been, the Great Depression slowed it down, then it just kept going back. And then in 2008, it went flat. It went down briefly, then it went flat. And I've been to a lot of utility meetings where I had my colleagues in the utility industry say, well, we're in a new normal. That's not just in a new energy economy, is that we have flat electric growth going forward. And it's going to stay flat forever in industrial economies. And I said, well, I think it's going to look just like the car curve, but it's going to be delayed by 3 to 4 years. And the reason it gets delayed is that the things that consume oil, you can make a decision when you have a job to buy it tomorrow, right? The things that consume electricity typically, in big quantities in our economy, when you decide that you're going to build a new house or a new manufacturing plant, these things have a time lag of anywhere from 2 to 4 years, roughly. I don't know if you looked at the EIA data for national electricity consumption last month, but for the year on year, it's up just below 3%. That's that tilt up. Does it keep going at that rate? I don't think so, but I think it's going to emulate the blue curve. I don't think we're in a 0.1% load growth future for America. I think we're not going to go back to 6% load growth, but the flat's, I think, demonstrably wrong. The reason it's wrong is because our economy is starting to grow again. And what's propelling the economy this time, you all know this. This is what's new about our economy, really, and this is what's new in energy terms. The new energy economy is associated with a new class of infrastructure, a new class of economic propulsion, which is algorithms and data and software. Software is everywhere. The software effect is very broad, and it can be measured 2 ways. How it accelerates the GDP of the economy broadly, and if you accelerate the economy, you get growth, you get people driving more, buying more cars, building more houses, building more office buildings, using electricity at growth rates faster than you can make it more efficient, not to mention the fact you've already squeezed all the efficiency out of the things that already exist. You can't make lights much more efficient. HVAC is not going to get much more efficient. So any net new construction is net new load. The epicenter of data consumption of energy or electricity specifically are the data centers. Some of you probably have data centers in your service territory. They're all over the country. Here's what you need to know about data centers. At the high level of abstraction, the world's data centers today consume more electricity, not just in the 3 million EVs. They consume more electricity today than 30 million electric vehicles would if they existed. That's the world's data centers. So we already have 10 times the load globally for making software operate than we do to plug in a car and drive it. Where's that going to go in the future? Up, and up fast. This is a picture of the world's biggest data center. It's outside of Reno. It's the Switch data center. It has more square feet under roof than the Burj Khalifa, the world's biggest skyscraper in Dubai. Skyscrapers are actually analogous to data centers. They're just real estate. It's a building, you know. Instead of housing it with stuff for people, you house it with stuff for silicon. Doesn't matter if you're a construction business. The interesting about skyscrapers and data centers in energy and in economic terms is that they cost about the same to build. It's roughly the same cost to build a data center and a skyscraper. Kind of interesting. A data center and a skyscraper have different energy consumptions. The data center uses 100-fold more electricity per square foot than a skyscraper. 100x more. That's not going down, it's going up. How many skyscrapers are in the world? There's a skyscraper website. You can find it. It's kind of cool. There's 1,500. How many skyscraper-class data centers are there in the world? 5,000. The build rate for data centers at a skyscraper class is 10 times higher right now than the build rate for data centers. The bottom picture, by the way, is inside a data center. These are glowing servers. There's no people in them. So when you provide incentives for a data center in your service territory, you're not really creating jobs except for construction. You are creating load demand, which is nice. One quick factoid for you, which is kind of fun. Everybody has a smartphone, right? That's just a radio. Radios aren't free in physics. You have to make the photons with electrons. The world's wireless networks, cell towers, consumes $20 billion of electricity a year, on track to $100 billion of electricity a year. Put in country terms, the world's cell towers consume more electricity than the country of Italy. And they're on track to consuming the amount of electricity the country of Japan needs for all purposes. We're in early days, though, of the digitalization of all parts of our economy. So this graph, I can tell you what it says. You don't have to read all the y-axis, but you can see what these names are. These are Bureau label statistics sectors of our economy, right? From construction and mining to chemicals to the media and education, entertainment industries. And what you're seeing on the x-axis is the percentage of their spending that's associated with information technologies, software and robots. And what you can see is that most of the economy is below 3%. And some parts of our economy are not even higher than 6 or 6.5%. Or put differently, there's just not a lot of spending yet on IT. As big as the industry seems to be, there's just not that much spending yet. Mostly that's because most software isn't good enough yet to do useful things in those other industries. And I mean that in non-facetious terms. It really isn't good enough yet. But it's getting good enough fast because of the access to the data centers, which are basically supercomputers in the cloud. As it gets better fast, this whole curve just blows out to the right. That has two effects. It will accelerate our economy, and it will accelerate the indirect consumption of energy. Or put differently, when the internet first began, a lot of people thought that would reduce air travel. In fact, at the dawn of the computing age and the dawn of television, when it was getting big in the 70s, that's when we had a big boom in both those businesses. People wrote about how teleconferencing would eliminate air travel. You may remember some of these claims. A lot of the claims have been made. Vint Cerf, who's one of the founders of the internet, inventors literally of the internet, said the opposite in the 80s. He said it would increase air travel for the same reason I wrote the same thing around the same time. It's because it's an economic lubricant. It makes it easier to have commerce and have connectivity around the world. It also makes it easier to go visit people. So in fact, air travel since the dawn of computing and the dawn of telecommuting, air travel has increased 700%. That will happen. This will now be accelerated again as we move into the next era of data growth. The next era of data growth, calling the Silicon Tsunami, is bigger than the past era. These numbers are so the y-axis is measured in something that telecommunications and information technology people talk in terms of bytes, and in this case it's zettabytes. Zettabytes per year of traffic. So instead of measuring miles per year of traffic or kilowatt hours per year, we measure bytes. We measure in a unit called zettabytes now. And you can see all of it, it's growing, everything, not just entertainment, but business, what I'm calling business pixels, that's video for business purposes, whether it's drones flying overhead, taking images for safety or for efficacy or for environmental controls. Productivity data, of course, is the industrial sector finally getting useful tools and sensors. Embedded, incidentally, means things like consumable computers, that is, computers that you will swallow with a vitamin pill each morning that is biocompatible and biodissolvable, but that will take vital functions for you, wirelessly connected to your secure smartphone so that you can have a baseline information. Would you care about that? Probably would. That industry is coming in the next decade because those technologies now are real. To Drucker's line, I'm telling you that not because I'm a science fiction imagination, because it's already happened. It will drive, those technologies already exist, they're just not commercialized yet. This will drive data consumption off the chart. This will drive the economy into a next great growth. Most of the economic benefits are going to confer in terms of percentage to America, because most of this is being invented here still, not in China. China's going to grow just fine, but our next splurge of growth is on track because of this, and it's not ethereal. Let me just finish up by telling you how big a zettabyte is, because and this reveals my bias as a physicist. You know, bits are electrons. Saying the obvious. It means you have to plug in a computer somewhere. I mean, whether it's battery powered or tethered, and if it's battery powered and a wireless network, everything that makes that possible is plugged in somewhere. So what is a zettabyte? Well, every bit's tiny, trivial amounts, literally millionths or billionths of a kilowatt hour associated with kilobytes. But when you get, it's a law of large numbers. If you have lots of bytes, trivial amounts per byte gets to be big. Here's what I want you to know. We're a 3 zettabyte world today. We're on our way to a 180 zettabyte world. All zettabytes are electrons. How big is a zetta? Zetta is a prefix like, kilo by megabyte, right? Terabyte, petabyte. Zettabytes are a really big number, 10 to the 21. You can't imagine that number. 10 to the 21, 3 zettabytes worth of dollar bills stacked up would go from here, the Earth, to the sun, and back 1 million times. That's how big a number that is. So it doesn't take, so the trivial amounts of electricity per zettabyte, it's okay. It's a lot of zettabytes. That's the world we're going into. So the last point I want to make is that I hope you don't take away from this a sense that I think that wind and solar are irrelevant in the sense of having a utility in the semantic sense of the word. Of course they have relevance and utility. It's not a new energy economy. What's new about the economy is what's going on, we all talk about it as if they're unconnected domains. It's the information revolution. That's obviously what's new about our economy, indifferent than any time in history. And it's an energy-using part of our economy by itself, and an energy-stimulating part of our economy. And it's going to be a good thing that we have all the above to supply the energy we need for this simple reason. The last time we had massive productivity growth post-World War II began after the recessions that hit post-World War II. This is a photograph that our parents would recognize. I don't think anybody in this room is old enough to have voted in the November 4, 1952 election. This is Walter Cronkite, you can see. He's standing at a Sperry Univac computer, which was the first computer ever to predict the outcome of an election in human history. This was the Eisenhower-Adlai-Stevenson election. That was the night of the election, and the Univac said that Eisenhower was going to win, and nobody believed it. You know the history. So, kind of interesting. The 20 years from 1952 to 1972 were one of the biggest growth periods in the US economy in history. Just astonishing growth. The next 20 years, and I'm just put this in global terms because we're a global supplier of energy now. We're a global player in manufacturing. Compare the 20 years from 1952 to 1972. The 20 years from now into the future, the world's economy will grow 5 times as much as it did in that 20 years, half a century ago. And the quantity of energy consumed by the world will increase 300% more over the next 20 years than it did in the 20 years from 1952 to 1972. That's a revolution. For that, you need everything. So you don't have the sense that I think that EVs are irrelevant, but they can't possibly fill this gap. Neither can wind, neither can solar, and batteries, not a chance filling this gap. They don't produce energy, they expensively store it. Your businesses are at the epicenter of this revolution, not just because you're not in the information technology business, but you're in the business that fuels the information technologies. And also, ironically enough, I'll end on this one sort of bullish note. I think if I wanted to make a forecast that's sort of out of line with what you're typically hearing, I think the forces of information technology, the combination of what 5G will enable in high performance network connectivity, the resurgence of manufacturing, and the one thing that millennials seem to be exhibiting on the leading edge is a desire to live where things are cheaper and more pleasant, plainer than in dense urban cores. I think there's actually a beginning of a trend, not towards the emptying of the heartland of America, of the population, but potentially a migration back of population and manufacturing into the heartland. I think that's beginning. You can see early edges of it. And your business, more than any single company in the country, obviously epitomizes from the border to border, my homeland north and our neighbors to the south. You occupy that space. It's an exciting future to be part of. I'm extraordinarily bullish for your business. It'll be a rough ride, the old expression, buckle up. Transition's not going to be easy, but I think it's very bullish for America, bullish for your business, and an exciting time to be in the electricity industry. I wish you luck. Have a great conference. Thank you.